Hello, dear listener. Editor JT here. We're excited to announce that by the time you're listening to this episode, our fall merch drop will be live at deprogramshop.com. Whether you want a little Fidel peeking out of your frocket, a lovingly recreated Don't Tread on Me sticker, or Hakeem's patented theory-carrying tote, we've got you covered. The drop is live right now through October 15th, so go snag a hat before they're gone. All patrons will also receive a special discount because you're our favorite little piggies. Thanks for your support, enjoy the merch, and now on to the show.
Hello everyone and welcome to yet another episode of the Deprogram. Today we have a very special return guest for you all the way from Russia, Konstantin, a dear friend of the show, an acclaimed journalist, documentary filmmaker, TV presenter, great geopolitical analyst, and most importantly, a Marxist comrade. Mr. Konstantin, thank you very much for coming on again. Could you please say a few words about your career as well as who you are to our dear listeners so that they can get to know you a little bit better?
Thanks for having me and for such a pleasant introduction. I'm a journalist. You're totally right. I spent over a decade or maybe 2 decades in journalism. I used to be a correspondent at the beginning of my career, and then I worked as a head of the U.S. bureau, an anchor, and eventually, after I discovered a Marxist in me, I quit my job in 2019. Since then, I'm focused on running my YouTube video blog and my social media accounts.
You will find links to all of Konstantin's work in the description below. I very, very warmly recommend this channel. Most of the content is obviously in Russian, so I recommend it to the Russian speakers as well as to everyone else who can survive the half-assed, decent, at this point, in my modest opinion, YouTube translation captions. But with that out of the way, let's get right into the meat of this episode and what an episode it will be, because we're basically covering what I would call the currently biggest topic in the world, which is the Ukraine war, the Russian invasion, the Russian NATO war, or the 700 different terms that have been ascribed to that. So let's start with what's been on everyone's mind for the past half a month. And excuse me if I sound like the resident conspiracy theorist here, but Konstantin, do you actually think that Prigozhin is dead?
Well, I think he is, although I won't be surprised if he's not. In the last 2 years, we kind of, at least here, we kind of got used to living in a bloody circus where everything is possible, even the most impossible things are possible. The most crazy things happen, and we are learning to live with it. Keep in mind that we are now I am talking to you under some mild limitations that exist here in terms of what I can and cannot say, especially when communicating with a foreigner. I mean, if I don't follow the rules, I may very quickly end up in a remote Siberian place, which I don't want to. And I would ask you to forgive me for that murky language in advance.
Absolutely,
I really hope to talk to you again in the future. So the question is, yes, I think what we saw on television and what we read in the news was real. I don't think that he is alive.
Understood. If so, and I believe you can answer this question without potentially any repercussions, without actually saying who you think might have done it. So we're not even going to go into that at all. But I'll phrase this question this way. Why now? Why not like a month ago when we all know what happened back then? Why, the interaction with Lukashenko and flying over there, then, constantly flying back, etc., etc. Do you think it was more of a PR move, give it some time so it's not too obvious? Is it just because this sort of thing takes or logistical organization? Maybe it's all just a coincidence and I'm looking too deeply into it.
I think that to answer with confidence with regards to why now, we need to be sure who did it. And that is still an enigma for me, obviously. It could have been anyone. It could have been anybody.
Absolutely.
But seriously, I think that because Wagner was such a serious force, and the capitalist state spent such a significant time and effort to build it, which is not a secret anymore. Because of that, to dismantle it, because there was a change of mind, change of plan, and the line of military command had to be straightened. There had to be just one boss remaining. Yeah. It couldn't have happened quickly, immediately after the decision was made. So 2 months is, I think it fits perfectly fine the whole agenda, the idea behind what we're seeing. I mean, you can't demolish such a massive structure quickly, even if it is already beheaded. Also, I want to mention that at the time when the mutiny started, the state television, which was obviously covering it, it symbolically called Prigozhin a traitor, and after that compared him with Pugachev. And Pugachev is a prominent historic figure here, the Cossack commander who started a rebellion against Catherine the Great. But what is even more important, he was eventually captured, tried, and quartered. So that was an analogy that could probably give you a glimpse of why it took so long and who could be behind it.
And I can also additionally imagine just how much logistical effort you need to put into place before cutting off, quote unquote, the head of the snake. Because, if it's a tiny little thing, tiny little organization, when you cut off a snake's head, it starts squirming all over. But when it's, what was the name of that gigantic Amazonian thing? Someone help me out. Anaconda. Yeah, when you cut the head of an anaconda and it starts squirming, it can bring down houses. So 2 months, as you perfectly well put, I guess makes sense. Actually, when you start inputting all of those factors that you mentioned, then 2 months even sounds pretty quick. Which moves us kind of into the next conversation where, Wagner was very, very popular, if I could use that term, all over the world, but it went into the absolute mainstream. And I think, random villagers in India probably know about it, mostly from the so-called Wagner Rebellion, which happened earlier this year. So as you, someone who was there, and especially a professional journalist and so on, I want to ask you, what was, the scene like at home when the so-called rebellion started? How did you feel? How did others? Was it a sense of skepticism, optimism, fear, or, depending on a person's political compass, all of those? I can tell you what I was doing to introduce, I guess, a bit of levity. I was in a random bar or a club, and a Russian friend of mine that I was supposed to be seeing then, he comes to me and he's like looking not disheveled, but he's like, kind of skeptically smiling, and I'm like, what's the smirk about? And he just shows me the phone. I'm like, what the fuck, is this actually happening? And he's like, I don't know if it's actually happening. Nobody knows if it's actually happening. So I'm wondering if he was a relatively decent representation of what you guys felt. So yes, please tell us.
Very similar. I think that was a very common reaction. You probably heard that one of the Wagner tanks was parked in front of the Rostov Circus.
Yeah.
And I think it tells it all. The feeling was one of an ongoing farce, although a bloody farce. A strange mixture of fear and irony is how ordinary people perceive it not only that particular incident, but the whole situation in general. As for me, we heard that the Wagner column is approaching Moscow. There were rumors that checkpoints are being built and firing positions installed. Nevertheless, we couldn't stop laughing. I swear you, we couldn't stop laughing because of the absurdity of the whole thing.
Yeah.
Obviously, and our comrades in Ukraine know it better than anybody. There is nothing funny whatsoever, but still, it was so absurd. And the mere piling up of that absurdity over yet another absurdity, it made you smile. So yes, we laughed. I have to confess, given that I was in Rostov 1 week before the whole thing began, and there was no sign of anything approaching. So I could have caught in this if I decided to stay there for a little longer. So I escaped miraculously this spectacle. So yeah, we decided to get to the nearest grocery store to get some food. That's all we could do, and many other people contemplated the same. And an absurdity it was. And when the march was suddenly abandoned, when Putin spoke on television and the Prigozhin team withdrew to Belarus, it was like, what the hell is going on? Exactly like you describe it. What the fuck was it? Circus. I think this was a circus, and it is a circus. I think despite all the losses of human life and destruction, this was the most popular metaphor on the web and in people's everyday communication.
Absolutely. That is a very direct picture that you paint, and I can very much so feel it, resonating through the microphone, quote unquote. And as much as sometimes it's feels unnatural to laugh at certain things, especially when human lives are involved and human lives are being taken, when it comes to such a precipice of insanity, and you're like, is this as well? Because I remember that my friend was saying, like, this as well, like, what's next? Like in
yeah,
3 days,
exactly.
Like,
I was going to
like,
say, yeah. Well, one you're quoting me. I was going to say the same thing. Are we going to be attacked by alien invaders?
there you go.
And even that won't make us tremble, because we already prepared.
You're gonna be like, okay, come for some chai. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, at this point, we don't even care. Yeah, oh Lord. I can imagine. But okay, going back from the aliens to the illegal aliens, Wagner. Why did they do it? The Russian military has a perspective on why they did it. The Ukrainians do. NATO does, of course. They all have their theories. But can you maybe give us, I don't know, the main perspective shared in leftist as well as mainstream Russian circles regarding the motivation behind the uprising? Was it really, a protest against Wagner being eaten up by the RF military apparatus, which is what Prigozhin pretty much, correct me if I'm wrong, said? Or did Prigo have bigger aspirations?
I don't know if I can speak on behalf of the whole Russian left movement, and I don't even think that such movement exists. But from the Marxist perspective, I think that we have to always look for contradictions in every matter of fact, every event, every act of human life or anywhere. We are looking for contradictions, and there was a plenty of them. I laid out my version, my view of what happened on my YouTube channel in the episode of I Get Prop, which is my news show. I publish it periodically. Previously it was weekly. I think that we should not look out for some hidden schemes or scenarios. What the whole thing meant was that there was a contradiction within the ruling class. And it doesn't really matter how we came to that and what caused it. I mean, personally, what were the names and institutions involved? The contradictions are real. They are becoming impossible to hide. And the further we get into the conflict, the more Prigozhins will surface. So it doesn't really matter what happened to this first one. There will be more, and they are just an epitome of the contradictions that are building. I think that I don't know if we touched that last time, but I think that that I said already a year ago that this war is not a war between Russia and Ukraine or even Russia and NATO. This is the early stage of another world imperialist war. And every imperialist war rises out of a bunch of contradictions within the capitalist society, capitalist world. So I think that looking at this Russian circus, making fun of it, we should, and you guys should, think of it as an example of what is ahead of us all. You can get a perception of what is awaiting for us in the future.
Absolutely. I really hope that you're wrong and that the contradictions are not as close to bursting that it would spill out to an ever greater and ever more consuming conflict to such an extent that it would become a world war. But
I'm pretty sure it will. Yeah. I hate to say it, but what I was trying to say is that it really has no relation to personalities. It doesn't matter how the two of them, Prigozhin and Putin, for example, communicated. It could have been anybody else. It just shows that the situation is so strained, that the effort and the resources spent are so great, so vast, that it will start breaking apart. The cracks will appear, and the cracks will appear everywhere. Same things are happening in Ukraine. We might not be aware of them, but they are there. And internal rivalry is the reflection of the inability of the ruling class to control the situation. And the deeper we get into this imperialist confrontation, the more rivalry we are about to see. And I'm pretty sure that on a greater scale, similar tendencies are palpable in the NATO apparatus. And because they are obviously frustrated, neither side is getting what they hope to this war to be. The disappointment, the disenfranchisement are felt on both sides, and this is one of the reasons why contradictions become so sharp and impossible to ignore.
So in the past half a year, we've seen multiple incursions into Russian territory proper. There were three approaches: bombing runs of Russian territories close to contested Ukrainian territory, actual troop incursions into Russian territory, mostly by what the West called freedom legions and so on, and lastly, direct drone hits in Moscow. Psychological warfare of quote-unquote bringing the war to the Russians so that everyday Joes, or Ivans in this case, get a better image of what war their state is participating in. Pretty classic approach used both by states and paramilitary and terrorist organizations for almost a century now. But what's more interesting to hear would be your assessment of whether it's actually working. Is it maybe even backfiring? You know, how is the Russian state and, more importantly, media apparatus reacting to it, and how are they maybe spinning it, if they even are?
I don't know exactly how the media apparatus is reacting because I don't have a television
smart man
TV set at home. I'm not following everything they are saying. I'm pretty sure that they are trying to make things look like there's nothing serious, that you won't be able to break our will and determination. But in fact, all the attacks and incursions that you mentioned, I don't think that they really have such an impact as somebody who planned them was hoping to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
And not because the Russian television is right, and you know, the classes of the Russian society are united around the Russian bourgeoisie and oligarchs. and we all feel ourselves as part of one solid nation. I think that the reason is an overwhelming apathy within the population. Like as I said, we were not surprised learning that the Wagner column is moving on Moscow. And if it were aliens invading us, we wouldn't be surprised either. Some of the drones sent from Ukraine were shot down not far from where I'm talking to you right now. And although there were some minor destructions, damages, caused by that, I feel and see that people are mostly irrelevant to that fact. They are not worried at all. There's no feel of panic, not because people are so fearless and
or patriotic,
courageous, or patriotic, but because they just don't give a shit.
Wow.
They are so frustrated. They gave up hope of seeing anything changing in their lives for the better, that they are used to living on a day-to-day basis. And
such a Slavic thing, but actually generally in capitalism.
So does that sound familiar to you?
That sounds like home. That sounds like beautiful, warm, dark, gray,
sweet
home.
Desperation. Like
absolutely
anything may happen. We what can we do about it? People
and
just
it's not like nihilism where you're like, okay, like absolutely nothing makes sense, absolutely just ride whatever horrible fire wave is flowing beneath your feet, and wherever life throws you, it throws you. This one is kind of, how do I put it? It's absolutely knowing that things can get better, but absolutely knowing that they are not going to, that kind of negativity.
I can go further. I think that we know that they will get worse, but since we can't do anything about it, and we don't want to do anything about it, and we don't want to because we are not forced by the circumstances of our everyday life. And this, if we take a look as Marxists at what's going on, I think that the deprivation, the problems that we're experiencing on all sides of the front line are, regardless of how serious they are, the losses of the conflict, they are still not enough to initiate the bigger movement of the working class or just of the society in general. There's still a lot to lose for many people. And it is quite common for many people to think that if everything goes down the tubes, at least I can survive, and I can. It doesn't relate to me. As far as I know, a very similar mood is in Ukraine, not where the war is like physically present and going on already, but if you drive 300, 400 kilometers from the front line, it is a petty bourgeois attitude to reality. It is universal. It's not Russian or Ukrainian, and it is still here. Regardless of how poor a particular person is, you can still psychologically be on that position, and I think that we are very far from feeling the pain seriously. Although, the human toll is high. It is blood and death and desperation on all sides and everywhere. Still, I think we are not yet close to the levels that we remember from history of the 1914 or the periods when the military conflicts started by the bourgeoisie eventually provoked the outburst of proletarian anger.
Absolutely. I mean, back then, the proles did not have their so-called class consciousness completely crushed by the ideology of hardcore bourgeois individualism, consumerism, and the sense that they are not a part of the whole, and whatever impacts the whole, they can potentially, hopefully, in some way avoid right up until the moment it comes right in front of their door. The lack of
it's like a gamble. You're always gambling that it's not going to be me. There's no spirit of desperation, and I'm afraid to say it because it might be a very unpleasant thing to hear, but unless you have that desperation in people's minds, they won't start doing anything to change the situation and to fight for their future.
Absolutely. I mean, one would argue that especially people from, for example, larger cities and so on, people super engaged in this sort of hyper-capitalist lifestyle of climbing the hierarchy and consuming as a form of personal representation of how high you are on the hierarchy, etc., probably got more pissed off about, for example, certain brands no longer being sold in Russia instead of the actual conflict which is going on, or for example drones literally hitting Russia itself. So I mean, this is a relatively cliche analysis, but at this point class identity is completely replaced by consumer identity, and the worst thing the enemies can potentially do is impact our day-to-day comforts. But as long as some of those comforts are there, combined with the hope that as long as some of the comforts are there for me, even when I see across the street that my neighbor's house is on fire, you continue playing that gamble, as you perfectly said it, thinking that your house is never going to catch on fire. I mean, I was very young back then, but from all the stories that I hear and so on, people in Belgrade specifically during the Yugoslav wars, etc., were living a very, very different life than people on the actual fronts all over.
Same thing here. If you take a walk on the streets of Moscow, you won't even guess that we are in the warlike situation with our neighbor, as Vladimir Putin said it. And I think it's similar in Kiev. At least that's what I hear from my friends in Ukraine. Yes, it is not that far, and it means that there's a lot to lose before people on all sides will start waking up.
And that analysis, I think, can be applied not only to places which are in conflict. I mean, it can be applied to places which are currently at war most intensively, because one would hope that being in a state of war, driven quite literally by bourgeois interests, would spark a bit more class consciousness, which we talk about so much here on the show. But even in bourgeois societies that are quote unquote in peacetime, where civil liberties are being pulled away and different even classic social democratic privileges are being taken away, everybody continues with this same logic that works so well, unfortunately, even in a war zone, which is it hasn't burned me yet, so I'm not going to complain. It hasn't burned me yet, so I'm not going to revolt. I'm attaching a cliche to a cliche, but that famous, saying, they came for the communists. I didn't say anything because I'm not a communist. They came for the labor union guys. I didn't say anything because I'm not a labor union guy. They came for the Jews. I didn't say anything when they came for the Jews, and then they came for me, and there was nobody to speak up, and so on. But this, even though this is a 70, 80-year-old poem, to this day, actually far more intensely now, because again, ideology, because of the ideology of capitalism, which has been so impregnated into the minds of the proletariat, who for some reason think that they themselves very often are the bourgeoisie, even though they're getting railed from the back every fucking morning when they go clock in, or far worse, every morning when they go into a fucking tank and go shoot at some other guy that is pretty much wearing the same shoes that they are, metaphorically, is still fucking applicable. But don't let me rant on anymore. I apologize.
No, you're absolutely right. This formula is applicable to our current reality. But I also think that we have to keep in mind Lenin's formula of the revolutionary situation, and there are two important points we should not forget: that the movement starts when the suffering, I'm quoting, the suffering and the want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual, and secondly, when as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses who uncomplainingly allow themselves to be robbed in peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn both by all the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. Nothing of that kind is being on the agenda today. We cannot see anything of that yet, but I'm sure that it's not the end of the day. And you mentioned your experience in Yugoslavia, right? I don't know if we talked about it last time, but I watched a really cool movie about the history of civil wars in Bosnia. And I don't know if, I wanted to ask if you heard about it. It's called Beautiful Villages.
One of my favorite films of all time.
Oh, you know,
yeah,
Lepasela, Lepagore.
Lepasela, Lepagore, man.
Yeah,
You hit me right in the heart, dude.
I was so impressed with it.
It is an incredible piece of art.
Yeah, very beautiful. And it shows the gradual development of every single character, for every family, of every person, as the war rages on, as more and more homes are consumed by fires, and it shows the evolution of the society into the unspeakable in peacetime levels of hatred. And I highly advise it. I was very impressed by it. Who's the director?
I don't remember specifically. I want to lie. I can check.
Tell you, it's Dragan Bielogorlic.
Bielogorlic, yes. He had a career after that, which was very good. I'm a fan, and I completely forgot he made it. But I think I showed that movie to like 5-6 people. It's one of the most underrated anti-war films of all time. And arguably my second favorite after Soviet classic, which viewers, if you do not fucking know it, Belarusian more specifically, I'm not gonna say the name because you're all supposed to know it, and if you don't know it, you should feel very, very bad. But Hakeem, you like now we gathered guys talking about this obviously harsh topic, but here particularly about how middle class and upper strata, but not only type of bourgeois people behave during a time of conflict. And you come from a country which had a very recent disgusting war. Did you see something relatively similar, even though
as in petty bourgeois outlooks, you mean?
The guys that were thinking that didn't really give a fuck about what is going on up until it literally rolled up to their doorstep.
Yeah. I don't think so. I think there's like a very interesting intersection between like Slavic populations and Arabs, is that we share a similar cynicism in general, but I think the difference with Arabs is it's less, or at least the way it is I've seen it in Iraq, is it's a lot less that people are worried about what's going to happen, and instead it's the assumption that, oh yeah, no, it's going to get worse. It's definitely 100% going to get worse. So I think very few people immediately start thinking, oh, this won't touch me. I think
everybody was like,
2003
oh shit.
and everybody immediately understood this is gonna, like, the question isn't if it's gonna, it's when and how do I prepare for it.
I remember that. Sorry for interrupting you, but you have to that Hakeem has a great quote from his dad when tell it to our dear guest and our viewers as well, when he was watching TV and he saw the Twin Towers fall.
Yeah, my dad basically said something to the effect of, like, how is this gonna, like, he was very somber and said something to the effect of, how is this gonna come back to us? Yeah. Essentially, like, something's gonna happen. This is gonna
come bite us in some way.
But yeah, I think for vast majority of people in this part of the world, the assumption is it's gonna get worse, and how best to prepare for it. Should that happen? So yeah, but the difference is, I think, the Iraqi experience is different from the Russian-Ukrainian one because the war was a lot more visceral in Iraq,
Yep.
right? Even in Ukraine, even on the front lines, it isn't as bad as it was in Iraq.
Oh, give us some time. It's not the end
Hopefully
of
it doesn't. Inshallah, it doesn't get that bad. But you never know. When two ruling classes are fighting over some pennies, the infrastructure and people tend to suffer.
Yeah. I think that we are on the path of of destruction of much greater scale. It's going to be, as I said, this is the very early stage of a major global military conflict. It already took away hundreds of thousands of lives. I know that Iraq was a more dramatic story, but it lasted for over a decade, and we are seeing that in a year. The level of destruction, the military engagement of both NATO and Russia and its allies it doesn't have analogies in the modern history. It's not like one superpower dropping bombs on innocent population and, killing people just for its imperialist ambitions. This is the beginning of the big imperialist conflict. It's not like we are being beaten by NATO, and it's not like what I'm trying to say. It is, although we already see it as a tragedy of enormous proportions, it is just the beginning. People don't believe me when I say that, but I'm confident. This is the beginning, and the situation won't stop there. We will see another front added, maybe more than one front added to it. And I'm thinking seriously that it is just a preface to a major military conflagration in Southeast Asia, because the two centers of capital, two imperialist centers in the world are the US and China. There's no way this contradiction might be resolved peacefully, and we saw it. There were numerous attempts to calm it down diplomatically. It doesn't work because it cannot work. So the only remaining path is a path to disaster, a path to an imperialist war, which is destined to be global. And again, you are seeing big military alliances expanding. I'm not even talking about NATO, it's Quad. It is a Russian-Chinese military agreement, and North Korea and Iran are all there. Russian and Chinese fleet is patrolling Alaska. And just yesterday, the US launched its intercontinental missile right after we launched ours. It is a very dangerous intersection, and I think that it couldn't even be compared to all the wars that we saw previously. It is we are balancing on the brink of a real catastrophe of such proportions that Ukrainian war will fade and look very insignificant in comparison.
I deeply hope that you're obviously wrong, as I said previously, and that maybe those capitalist contradictions can be relatively smoothed out at a point at which capitalists inside of these individual states start understanding that the interests of their more general state is below their own need to garner and build more capital, which kind of creates a more international connection of capital, which does not lead to direct conflict, because that would lead to less profitability for certain industries while a massive increase of profitability for others. But this is obviously becomes a very complicated conversation, and we end up straying away from the main point. And obviously it depends on how or if this current, very specifically current Ukrainian-Russian conflict goes. So to kind of take it a few steps back, your thesis that this will grow into more and more global conflict. More international. Yeah, let's start with kind of one player that has always been there, kind of levitating, or whatever term I could use. What and that specifically is Belarus. Most be it Western analysts or just everyday Joes trying to get what Belarus is doing in these current developments is kind of hard to understand. Is it just theater? Where does Lukashenko and the interests of his administration stand, and so on? What's your view on basically Belarus's role, Lukashenko's role in this conflict? Is he really, as it's presented, best friends with Putin, or is that relationship a bit more complicated?
I think that his best friend is China, and he's playing a role of an intermediary between Russia and the West, Russia and China. And due to the growing political instability inside Belarus, he's more attached to Russia now. But there were very, very visible contradictions between the Russian governing elite and the Lukashenko circle in the past, up until the people's protests in 2020. He was very very skeptical towards moving closer to Russia, and now it all changed, but not because Lukashenko changed, because the political situation is changing. I think that again, Ukraine is, we cannot go very far from my supposition that this is not an isolated military conflict. It's a part of the bigger competition. And when something is happening in Belarus or Kazakhstan, in Russia itself, it has very immediate and direct relation to the Chinese interests. I see it as a manifestation of the Chinese economic expansion to the West, and the West's very distinct desire to use all means possible to stop it. It is competition. What capitalism is competition. So we're seeing competition through other means. And Lukashenko, to me, he's just a representative of the Chinese capital, of the Chinese. He has his own interests, obviously, but he's acting in this team. And what makes the situation similar to the one of the beginning of the 20th century is that the two major camps, and 2 years ago it wasn't so evident, now it is evident. The camps are solidifying themselves, and the more and more countries are forced to choose sides. It's either China and Russia and some other countries in the middle, like Belarus or Iran or North Korea, or it's the good old West, NATO, the US, Japan, etc. So it's very similar. It's almost analogous to what drove the world to World War One, and the reason for that similarity is also understandable to a Marxist, because the fundamentals, the economic fundamentals of the imperialist competition are unchanged. We are often criticized by our opponents here who are claiming that China is a socialist country and a country of the socialist revolution, where proletariat is the ruling class, not the capitalists. So this is why they claim we have to be supportive of the Russian-Chinese alliance, and all leftists, either here or in the West, have to be in this camp. But what we are seeing is that this is a classical example of capitalist competition, and it is usually accompanied, in the era of imperialism, it is usually accompanied by an economic crisis. And look, this is exactly what's happening on the world stage right now. The global economy is stagnating. The crisis of 2008 is not over. It is approaching its culmination. And the only remaining engine of the global economy, China, is cooling down. Usually, as we should remember from history, these two things walk hand in hand. The global economic crisis and the imperialist war of the global proportion. I see it. I'm sorry for driving back to my favorite track, but this is also, to me, when I look at Lukashenko, I see him playing a very logical tune, but that tune also melts into the whole ensemble of the growing imperialist competition, and he's just a minor player.
Absolutely. So no matter what someone, particularly be it a comrade or not, thinks about the Chinese system or Russian actions in Ukraine or NATO actions in Ukraine or who, quote unquote, is in their eyes the beacon of hope in this future conflict, or the devil incarnate themselves. Most people kind of have their own camp, as you very eloquently put. But what's kind of interesting, and it was interesting to most people at the beginning of World War I as well, is those certain players that have kind of stayed either relatively undecided, or it seems that they are kind of changing their position. I don't know if you've noticed, mostly in liberal states, or what liberals would call conservative states, but we all know that those are kind of the same tent. Have you noticed a certain kind of shift when it comes to their position towards their official position towards the conflict? I mean, we've seen far-right leadership coming into power in Italy after having multiple times said that they are very skeptic of the support towards Ukraine and the war, and then they came into power and that tune changed. We know about Hungary's constant balancing of we're here, we're there, we're here, we're there. We know what the French far right thinks as well, and far left. Serbia is obviously, to get a mention, is trying to balance it like always, while also selling weapons only to one side, and so on and so on. Basically, where my question is directed at is, how do you think this is going to play out when it comes to these liberal states that are undecided? Is it just going to, be the local bourgeoisie of those states, putting their best bet on whatever player they think will eventually lead them to accumulating more capital, or are there, some more reactionary, or one could even call them, social stakes at play here? Traditional allies, some realpolitik, as the liberals like to call it.
I think that it is, and it will be going on according to this historical analogy that I already drew. Like Bulgaria and Romania in 1913, 1912, and other smaller countries were stuck between the two major military groups and major economic camps. Same thing is happening today. And it is very sad for them, but yes, they would bet on the most, in their opinion, on the side that will guarantee their capitals and their security of their possessions. It's hard to predict where will each and every one of them end up. But look at Turkey, again, as you said, look at Serbia, Hungary, and it doesn't matter if you're rightist or leftist. In Spain, there are socialists, there were socialists in power up until recently, and they were supporting NATO, not because they are socialist or because they are traitors of the socialist cause, but because this is the interest of the Spanish bourgeoisie. And same thing is happening in all other parts of the world. Look at Latin America, looking at East Asia, what's going on in Vietnam, in Thailand with its current turbulence around the prime minister. Everywhere.
Half of Africa,
Africa, exactly, Africa. And everybody is very frightened. I think that the elites know exactly, they feel at least where we are going. And it's like somebody's being dragged into a meat grinder, and it is historically predetermined. There's no way you can avoid it. You have to pick sides. You have to choose where you should be, and and everybody understands that if you make a wrong decision, the consequences might be fatal for you. So this is why they are trying to balance the interests of conflicting powers, and they don't want to make their bet for as long as it is possible. But everybody would have to do that. There will be no independent outsiders. Nobody will be able to watch it from afar. It is the nature of the imperialist war. There's no shelter. The front line is going to be everywhere. So, as I said, right now we are seeing it when the Russian Ukraine is fighting against American Ukraine. I think this formula is close to what I'm trying to express here. The countries dependent on the bigger imperialist blocs and interests are engaged in fighting today. Tomorrow it will be much worse, and more actors will be dragged into this orbit.
Well, to finish with this thing,
I hate to be so pessimistic, but
no.
This is on
Sometimes
what's on my
it's
mind.
necessary. Absolutely.
And throughout this year,
yes.
when it all started in February 2022, I said it is not Russia versus Ukraine. It is not Ukraine. It is not Russia versus NATO or whatever the Anglo-Saxons, as the Russian capitalists are trying to present it here. I said it is the beginning of the major clash of capitalists, capitalist groups, and it's going to be China versus the US in the end. Like it was Germany versus the UK in 1914, and Germany plus all the satellites, and the Anglo-Saxons plus all their satellites, and we're seeing the same model reborn today. It is still adequate. It is still relevant, not because we want it to be so, but because we are still living in the age of imperialism, studied and analyzed by Vladimir Lenin.
I would add, though, I think that I don't think pessimism is the correct word for it. I wouldn't describe the situation during World War I as pessimistic. These sort of events, with as much misery as they bring, also happen to be the kernels or the seeds of the most liberatory
absolutely
attempts
fully
by
humanity.
humanity.
Yeah. Without that,
striding forward.
Yeah, you're totally right.
Exactly right. And we need to remember that, as Mao said, with the first spark around the Paris Commune, it was an insignificant amount of people that fell under sway and allowed socialism to be birthed. By the First World War, it was essentially Russia and all the states around it, and then by after the Second World War, it was a third of humanity. And with the next one, hopefully, inshallah, it will be a far more for lack of a better term, globalized movement, which will allow also these liberatory projects to go onwards and make new strides and new gains and make up for the time that had been lost since the end of the 90s and the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union and all the other mistakes that have been made in our history. So pessimism isn't the right word. I think it's a sober analysis as to whether it will come to pass or not. We'll see.
Yeah,
But the most important thing is to be
desperation sometimes, as I said, it is needed for revolutionary awakening.
Exactly right, yeah.
You have to have that feeling that there's nothing left to lose, and only that makes you stand up.
Yeah, the flower of revolution grows from fire, as they said. Let's now I was translating like a Serbo-Croatian, the fucking thing, and it sounded so fucking cringe in English. But yes, no matter which analysis ends up being correct at the end of the day, it truly is going to be socialism or barbarism, or in this case, if Konstantin analysis comes to be, it is going to be socialism or death. Thank you very much. Thank you, Konstantin, for coming on. This has been a very, let's call it, somber but necessary overview of something that impacts you and your family very, very directly, and countless of families, be it in the region, but also, as we know, how the global economy works internationally, and potentially will very directly impact people in the future. Konstantin, please tell our beautiful Tavarishi here in the audience where they can find your work, and all of the links are obviously going to be down in the description.
Thank you. It's all on YouTube. I don't think that I need to give you some more advertisement for myself. Thank you so much for having me. As always, it is a great honor for me just to know that there are people, like-minded people in other parts of the world that are still willing to talk to us, to listen to us, and did not forget about the necessity of building the international solidarity of working class people.
Absolutely, my brother.
This has been the Deprogram. I'm Hakeem.
I'm Yugopnik.
And I'm Konstantin.
All gonna die.